Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. I'm glad we all got in before the torrential rains begin, which is already a good sign for us. So welcome, everyone. My name is Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University. I want to welcome all the students who are here on the Georgetown campus, and I want to welcome the many, many people who are dialing in our Facebook Live presentation today. We are going to have a one-on-one discussion with Minister Khalid Payenda on all aspects of Afghanistan, recent history and future prospects. We'll speak for about 35-40 minutes together, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience here, as well as questions from Facebook Live. We have someone monitoring the Facebook Live chat, so if you want to add a question and any of the issues that we discuss, please put your question into the chat. And then we will go back and forth between the live audience and the chat in the question and answer period. So I'm extremely pleased to welcome at this absolutely historic moment in our relationship with Afghanistan and Afghanistan's future. I'm extremely pleased to have Khalid Payenda here. Khalid, Minister Payenda, I should say, we worked together several years, so excuse me if I quickly move into the familiar with him.
Sure.
But he served as acting Minister of Finance of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan from January through just days before the fall of the Ghani administration. So he was there really up until some of the last days of the Ghani administration. But in addition to serving in that role and overseeing the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan, he had spent really a decade in a series of roles across the Ministry of Finance. So really, he has, over the course of the international engagement with Afghanistan, seen the process of institution building, warts and all, from the inside. Through many and various roles in the Ministry of Finance, on just about all aspects of Ministry of Finance policy. And before that, he worked at the World Bank, where I was privileged to know him and engage with him while I was at the World Bank, and a number of international development agencies and think tanks on economic development and public financial management. And he also, I want to mention, because at this moment, thinking about what happens to students and the future of education, Minister Payenda co-founded the first private university in Afghanistan, and he taught economics and leadership courses there for over a decade. He's a Fulbright scholar. He graduated from the University of Illinois here with a master's degree in economics, and he also holds an MBA. So we're thrilled to have you. Welcome to Georgetown University.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. My greetings to the students here and the Facebook Live audiences.
Well, I'm going to start, as I mentioned, you were there almost till the very end. But I think really maybe 10 days before the departure of President Ghani from Afghanistan, you resigned from the Ministry of Finance. You resigned at the time, your announcement said you resigned for personal reasons. I want to give you a chance to tell us about that period, the period leading up to the fall of the Ghani administration. What led you to resign? And maybe if you can, describe to us what it was like to be in the cabinet, in those sort of final days.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll take a step back. I was at the Ministry of Finance until end 2018 as a Deputy Minister for Finance. I oversaw budget and treasury management and fiscal policy. And I thought it was a time to leave because there was a new minister who had different ideas, not compatible with mine. And I came back to the United States. I went back in January at the request of the president because he had made a couple of disastrous appointments at the ministry, and ministry was in a really bad shape. I went to help. I thought it was an important national duty. I did not want to grow old and then have the remorse of I had the opportunity to help and did not help. So I went there. The biggest issue was a budget that was becoming really problematic with the parliament. There were tussles, parliament felt insulted by the president's comments that they don't have a role in the budget, and resolved that, that's how I got into the role. I went at a 3-hour notice from the president. I did not put in conditions, but when I went there, I had a list of conditions, but the president preempted me on all of them, and he said, you have full authority to restore Ministry of Finance at its rightful place, being an institution which is professional, apolitical, and full of cadres, and I was given that opportunity to repatriate a lot of people who had left Ministry of Finance in the last 2 years. So we got the Ministry of Finance up and running really quickly. Why I resigned? Because I thought that support in the last few days was withdrawn. There
Support
was
from the president.
Support from the president. I think the war had a toll on his psyche, and he saw everything with suspicion. And I think that trust was not there anymore. So I offered to resign. I gave my resignation, and then did not hear from him 3 days after the resignation, and I packed my bag and came back because I thought it was the right thing to do. And if I was not the right person for the job, and as I told him, if there were expectations that I could not fulfill, maybe somebody else could take on. I did not have the foresight of the collapse, the sudden collapse of Kabul. Maybe it was just exactly a week before the collapse happened that I was back here.
So two things I wonder how you reacted to and how surprising they were. One is the decision of President Ghani to leave. Was that come as a great shock to you? Were you surprised by it? And then, all of us seem to be surprised at the rapid collapse of the administration, broadly speaking. From your vantage point, did you expect it to happen so quickly?
I did not expect it to be this quickly. Nobody actually did. I was also extremely shocked and saddened by President's departure because of the assurances that he gave to everybody, that he would stay, he would fight till the end, and then it was a shock. It's something that is still sinking in, for not just me, for a lot of people, maybe millions of people who've seen the country, which was, despite its problems, on a trajectory that was upwards, to suddenly, undo 20 years of work and good work and sacrifices. It was a shock. Kabul's collapse, I thought it was unsustainable with the situation, that it could manage for long term, maybe 2-3 more years, because we had some commitments from international donors to help. As you know, 75% of the budget is donor financed, and those financing was secured. Our revenues played a smaller part, but I thought we could survive a couple of more years until an interim government was put in place. There was some sort of peace deal made, but the speed with which the collapse happened has shocked almost everyone.
And can you explain a little bit what was it like at the cabinet level, in those final few weeks? How was the president's grasp of the situation? How do you feel his leadership style, recognizing that he was under, of course, enormous pressure? Even that by then, no one thought it was going to be pressure that would lead to his withdrawal. But just give us a sense of what his leadership style was like in those last weeks.
So Afghanistan, with my experience in the last all 20 years, we had two Afghanistan. One that we were working on, and it was all addressing issues of systems, electronic payments, digitalization. We had this digital digitalization week, where most of the civil servants would be paid electronically. Their attendances would transfer automatically to Ministry of Finance through systems, no intervention from people to manipulate it, and then calculations happening and electronically fired to the central bank and payments made to individual accounts. This we piloted the last week. It was a big event, and we had sort of similar issues on and progresses on development front. But then there was another one, which was of country in fight. Where a country where you had increasing instability. On last few months, some projects were not. We all knew that were not going to be implemented. For example, a road from point A to point B, if it had a distance of 200 kilometers, was not going to be built because of insecurity. So there was sort of one on development, very focused. If you sat in those meetings, you did not think you were in a war-torn country. And then other ones that I sat in many meetings on, Security Council meetings discussing the fight, which was a completely different one. President, I think, at those days managed it well. He was focused. His point and what we all believed was that Afghanistan's government should not become one-dimensional, focused only on war, and because this is what the terrorists want, and we would progress with development. But unfortunately, this also meant that with the leadership style of the government, a brilliant man with so much innovative ideas, his style was something that inhibited and did not allow for open discussions. His temper was too much for some ministers, so you would not have a lot of open discussions in the cabinets. This meant that over the time, he had limited number of people who would come with him with frank feedback because they were afraid of his temper and they would be fired or something else. And over the time, if you see the really good people who gave him advice, left the government. He was left with a few people who controlled every information that got to the president. So unfortunately, in the last few days and the last meeting that I had with him, and I decided that I'm not going to stay one more day, is because he was completely withdrawn from reality. He was focusing on payments of contractors that I, as the Minister of Finance, should not spend my time on. It's somebody lower level at the Treasury Department who would do this. But that style of management meant that he had in Afghanistan and his image that came from briefings. And mostly those people who provided briefings were not giving honest information to the president. So he was being played and manipulated. While he thought, he would be reading 200-300 pages every morning, but those pages mostly came from a few people who knew that the work was not important. It was more important to portray a picture of the institution to the president. Some of us, including myself, did not focus a lot on reporting to the president on minor issues. I thought it's my area of responsibilities. I should deal with my ministry's issues. It's a tough time, why escalate something so minor? So I think the leadership style was a big issue and the speed of collapse. The only time that I saw a really candid and open discussion at the cabinet was unfortunately after the collapse on a WhatsApp group that the ministers had. Everybody spoke up with frustration and how they felt betrayed, and they did not see this coming.
So
it was
the
unfortunate.
ministers talking to each other on WhatsApp
Talking to each other. Exactly.
After Ghani left.
Yes.
Were any of them aware that Ghani was leaving?
No, not even his two VPs, the first VP and the second VP, that he would open every meeting calling them brothers. You don't leave your brothers behind.
Now, there are rumors that as he left, as the president left, and as Minister of Finance, you would be aware of the possibilities for sort of significant movements of money and finances and the potential for fraud and corruption. There are anecdotal accusations that as it was clear that things were coming to an end, and people saw that there was an exit, there was a clear exit. The Americans were going, the international community was changing its relationship, the Taliban were approaching, that kind of opened up for, even by the standards of corruption that Afghanistan had seen, a kind of almost a free-for-all as everyone tried to manage to get whatever they could. How do you see the level of kind of corruption, especially as the system was kind of coming to an end, if you will? The Ghani administration was coming to an end. Do you think that there was large-scale corruption, that it affected the uppermost regions of the government?
I worked with the Ministry of Finance for almost 10 years. Worked on all different aspects except one, which was the customs, custom duties. Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan is very big, so in Ministry of Finance you do treasury management, budget, policy, and aid management, state-owned enterprises, state-owned banks, revenue management, sort of like IRS is one department there, and then the customs, which brings 50% of the revenues. I had not worked on it intentionally because of the stigma of corruption. The last 7 months as the minister, I saw a very ugly underbelly of who and how they were involved. It was very disappointing. The scale of corruption was huge in customs. Mostly the ones that were obvious to a minister of finance were the parliamentarians. They had their people and different provinces as customs officers. They would bring other people's applications for job to the ministers. And with the vulnerability Ministry of Finance had, because you had a budget to pass every 2 times a year. First a budget at the start of the year, and then the mid-year review. And if you were not just an acting minister, you wanted to be voted in, you had to make compromises. So there was, like, my predecessor had appointed 1,300 people in over 10 months, in an institution which is around 8,500. So there was corruption, but the corruption was such that it's very difficult to prove. But if I see something and I know the sources and I know the sort of corruption. So it was mostly in appointments and customs. It was also, unfortunately, in some places and security sector as well. Some highly corrupt people, appointed lately that would baffle most of us. We had an APF, a public protection force, very lucrative, that would charge for security services to international community, to private and the government institutions. One of the most corrupt people I know was put in this, which was baffling. So you could see that there were different levels involved, including the president's office. My deal with the president was that the appointment peshnahad, or the request that I'll bring, will not go through your office. I'll bring it to you personally. You will sign them, and then I'll take it to your office for registration and dissemination. Because I had seen it go through that process previously, and then they would meddle and say, can you add this person? Can you remove this person? And there were cases where people would pay for the appointment. Sometimes, depending on positions and where in custom office, where would you be? Like somewhere in Herat, which brings a lot of revenues, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then monthly. I had one of the MPs who would come after an election that they had for a committee in the parliament and say, can you hire this guy Actually, he said, can you replace this guy in this customs because he's not bringing me enough money, and I had to pay $1 million bribing other MPs to regain my chair as the head of the committee. So that was unfortunately the scale of it. And
so $1 million bribes would pass to
Yes.
members of parliament, and they would reap that through customs revenues and getting their people in place at customs revenues in order to gain that money. What do you think was the role of the international institutions who were funding the development of these institutions, and the Ministry of Finance, Customs, supporting the parliament? What role, any complicity that you think that international institutions might have in the scale of corruption that eventually impacted Afghanistan?
so mostly the development institutions had, for example, the World Bank had the fiduciary role of safeguarding the donor money that they managed, a trust fund, probably the biggest trust fund in the world, the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. They had mechanisms that they had third-party monitoring that would go and check their money. So that was, that assurance for the donors. But then they mostly focused on not the big picture, but just certain issues within the bigger cycle. My fight with them for the 2 years was that you have to look and what we call the follow the money cycle through the whole budget cycle, not just one mechanism where you filter projects at the Ministry of Finance. They were very focused on that. They were very focused on a revised external audit law. But when you look, the corruption happened somewhere else. All the projects through the year would go through that funnel that the World Bank created, submitted to the parliament. Parliament would reject your budget. You go back and then deal with them, and they would give you a list of projects that don't go through any economic or social or spatial analysis, and they would be added. So this funnel, for example, created by the World Bank was redundant. So there, unfortunately, the focus mostly by international community was that they did not, unfortunately, see the bigger picture. They dealt with portions of it. One of the things that I did, I'm sorry, taking time on this.
I want to ask you one specific question, because I remember I saw something that you yourself had prepared, where you did a kind of organogram of corruption in Afghanistan. So here's the bigger picture. And I actually saw a PowerPoint slide that you put together that sort of just runs through the whole process and says, here's where the vulnerabilities are to corruption. And you presented that back to the international community. What was the response?
I presented it first as a consultant 2 years ago, but then when I went as a minister, I think the reception was good. Okay, you should do it. World Bank was reluctant because of maybe good reasons, because of the turnover and the quality of counterparts that they had in the government. So they said, let's not go with grand schemes. Let's do something manageable that's doable within even poor leadership in these ministries. So maybe they were practical, but the reaction was good mostly, but I think it was too late. It was too late. Tried to repackage this for the leadership of the government maybe a month ago, and I called it the corruption ceasefire. I said
corruption ceasefire?
Corruption ceasefire. I presented it to the president, the VPs, the Chief Justice, the National Security, Office of the President, main ministers. Unfortunately, the reception was bad. They mostly saw it as a Ministry of Finance problem. And maybe I went a bit too technical, I don't know. But it was very disappointing to see the only real feedback I got was from the Chief Justice after the meeting, that you should not call it a corruption ceasefire because this implies that we did not have a ceasefire in the last 20 years. And I said exactly that's what my point has been. My point was, if we don't fix this corruption, this will bring down this whole republic. And unfortunately, this is exactly what happened.
Well, I want to turn to thinking about what the future of this Republic is going to be now. Because you've mentioned, and there's been limited discussion of, what are the prospects economically for the collapse or potential collapse of Afghanistan. We know that Afghanistan is heavily reliant on international donor funds. We know that a significant portion of Afghanistan reserves are held by the United States, which has not been releasing those, and by access through the IMF. We know that a significant portion of salaries were paid for through donor engagement. We know that energy costs, electricity, oil, and others are largely financed from external payments being held. When that is essentially frozen, when that's pulled, what are the prospects and what do you see for the future of the Afghan economy? What do you think is going to happen in the next months?
Just a bit of background. In June, I launched the government's appeal for humanitarian assistance, because even before the collapse, Afghanistan was facing a third very bad wave of COVID. The first two were not so bad. The third one was really bad. We had a drought in central and northwestern Afghanistan, a quarter of country, and it's places where people have livestock, and they were dying, and they had to then be displaced somewhere else. So a lot of IDPs, not just because of the war, but because of the drought as well. So the situation was already really bad. From 2012 onwards, from a double-digit growth, we were from 2001 or 2 until 2012, we had a decade of 10% plus growth every year. Suddenly stopped to almost zero, between 1 and 2 and below 1. And right now, the situation looks really, really bad. As you rightly put it, right now it's on a freeze because everything has collapsed. The banks are closed. You don't know the extent of it. The exchange rate of Afghanis per dollar, it's around, it used to be 79 when I left. It's right now around 86, but it's because most of these banks, money providers are closed. Maybe it will shoot up to 200 per dollar in a week or two. While our budget is small, but to give you a magnitude of how much comes from donors, we had half of our national budget financed by donors. So out of the $5 billion, 2.5 came from donors. Most of development was done. Off budget, meaning things that were directly provided by donors. It's around 4 billion more, 3 for security, 1 to 2. We don't know the exact amount because of the reporting. Off budget, so a lot of money in a country where it needs $7-8 billion to run a country. You could raise on a good year only $2 to $2.5 billion. So the risk came from donors. With everything stopping, it's catastrophic. We had some human development indices, shooting up, astronomically in the last 10, 12 years, the maternal mortality and all of this. This was all funded by donors, the basic package of health, if it stops, community development, education. And around 800,000 to 1 million civil servants, plus the security forces. So 800 to 1 million families that depended on the salary that the head of the household got. So maybe 6 to 8 million people that depended on salaries. They aren't paid on 21st, I guess, August onwards, end of our month. It's a catastrophe. I hear of people who, with our push to move from traditional to a banking sector, and suddenly the minute savings that you had is all frozen. It's bad. I've heard of people who have knocked on neighbors' doors for 2,000 Afghani loan to be able to buy bread. It's going to have a major impact. When you look at the external sector and your imports and exports, so that the trade balance, it's bad. We don't have any exports. The exports that we had were on the best year just close to $1 billion, while imports 7 to 8 and even to up to $10 billion. The aid that came filled in for the exports. So that's going to have an impact. The electricity came from Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. If you don't pay the bills, they will switch it off. Maybe this month, maybe the next month. And even if you have money in your foreign reserves are frozen here in the U.S., you cannot procure U.S. dollars to pay for them. The internet services provided, they exactly the same issue with them. So it's a multitude of areas.
And what do you think? What are the prospects that the Taliban or some coalition with the Taliban could start to stabilize the situation, get people into the ministries? Because you say if 800,000 to 1 million civil servants could essentially go unpaid because they can't cover the payments, I assume that an enormous number, like people even in your own staff at the Ministry of Finance who are running the ministry, have left. The Taliban have not been governing, obviously don't have the kind of experience or capacity to run ministries. What do you think the prospects are that either some form of coalition or the Taliban itself could figure out how to kind of begin to stabilize the situation?
I think without the continuation of the grants and donor aid, it's no matter how well you re-equip these institutions, it's going to be impossible. If you have people and staff, but you don't have the programs because the funding is stopped by the World Bank or frozen by a loan frozen by IMF or the reserves here, it's going to be impossible. What services would you provide? How would you pay your civil servants? The security forces that have been dismantled, 300,000 at its peak, how are you going to pay when the US and Sistika paid for it? It looks really difficult. It looks sort of impossible. It's going to be a major shock is inevitable. Maybe they say around 20 out of 35 plus million people are under poverty line, meaning earning less than $2 a day. That remainder is not well off and well above the poverty line. They're lingering around the poverty line. And a small shock would send, I assume already, millions into this shock, unfortunately.
Well, some people are suggesting that China, Russia, Iran, and other countries might come in, if not to replace the funding that's available, to do something that might take advantage of the gap, to strengthen their engagement with the new government and with Afghanistan. What do you think the prospects are for Russia, China, Iran, and others to come in and make up for that gap?
I think difficult because the EU repeatedly pledged that it would stay in Afghanistan committed even if the US does not. But when you look at the numbers, it was just a fraction of what the US provided. Nobody is going to have that depth of the purse. But every neighbor has its own strategy towards Afghanistan. Pakistan wanted this. They wanted a failed state where India could not have any influence. Iran wanted US to withdraw. Maybe similarly Russia with the Stans in the north. You have a river, and I think their strategy is make sure that nobody crosses the river on our side. Whatever happens on the other is not really a big issue for them.
And China, given the potential for access to mineral resources and other things that China is interested in, again, any potential that China come in with resources in exchange for access to Afghans' resources?
They would come, but not with resources, but for resources, unfortunately. And when you look at their interventions in other places in Africa, they don't bring development with them. They bring Chinese workers, and they bring maybe loans, and they extract the resources and minerals. I don't see China stepping in big time to help. Maybe they would need assurances from Pakistan that they don't have infiltration to the Muslims and Uyghur, and then that's all the assurance that they need.
So in 6 months' time, what is Afghanistan going to look? What is the Afghan economy going to look like?
I hope there is a talk on forming a government. We should learn from the 2001 Bonn Agreement, where we left out Taliban. I think that was a historic mistake. For Taliban to repeat it to the other side would still be a mistake. An inclusive government is important. Unfortunately, right now, as of yesterday, Afghanistan is off headlines of the news. The hurricane has taken its place, and before that, it was all focused on evacuation, not on Afghanistan. What happens? What sort of government? What sort of leverage you still have on Taliban to make sure that they come and accept a coalition government? There is absolutely no talk of the protection of some gains that we had these years. What about women and human rights? I think the international community and the US still has that leverage to make sure that sort of a government forms. If it does not form, that's the worst case scenario. You would have a lot of people living in destitute. Economic prosperity is not necessarily important for Taliban to have a grasp on people. They did it for 4 or 5 years. There are other regimes like Fidel Castro's Cuba, for decades to rule. But that could be, unfortunately, a likely scenario if the international community does not step in.
Are there any signs that the Taliban is looking for ways to stabilize the situation? You worked at the ministry, you led the ministry, you know a lot of the staff who control fairly complex processes of public financial management, payment. You talk about a whole new payment system of how you pay government workers. Paying government workers is an important part of keeping the state whole. Has the Taliban, elements of Taliban or potential coalition partners reached out to you or to the networks of staff that you used to work with to try to see if they could put together some form of new management of the ministry?
They have reached to me. They have reached to my staff. But what they've been saying so far and what has been the practice is two completely different things. They have been saying we cannot run these complex systems. We need the civil servants, the competent ones to come. And then another message would be, we don't need everybody. Certainly, we don't need the women. It's not safe for them. They should stay at home right now. But we need the technical people who ran these complex databases. Afghanistan financial management, the revenue system, the customs system. But then you see appointments. You see appointments of mullahs from madrasas, to keep positions within the government and within Ministry of Finance and its other entities belonging to them, which is not encouraging. I don't think what they say and what they do is the same. But they have also been points about how much they can pay. They've hinted to maybe 1/20th of what a good, competent mid-level manager used to get under us. to be paid. I don't think people can survive on $40-50 a month as salaries.
One thing that probably I think people in the audience don't understand is that the highest level of Afghan civil servants, their salaries were paid partly by donor contributions, top-ups, and others in order to keep competent staff, attract competent staff, bring back Afghans from the diaspora. With that money gone, those wages will then plummet back to sort of Afghan civil servant wages, which are unlikely to kind of enable people at the highest levels, to keep their families. What's happening at the Ministry of Finance? Is this the building closed? Are the systems shut? Is anybody just manning, any of the kind of core processes, or is essentially you're just in a holding pattern?
The processes are closed, but I follow this Facebook page of the ministry. You see their meetings. There is no minister yet. It's the Economic and Financial Council of Taliban. Their head and a few key having meetings with traders and listening to issues and all of this. But I haven't heard of any of those complex systems, moving. Everything seems to have shut down.
Well, I want to ask you, I guess, one final question before I open it up to the audience for questions. Is what is your advice now to the U.S. About next steps? I mean, given the nature of the withdrawal, given the kind of credibility perhaps that this has impacted America's role in Afghanistan, given the potential difficulties in managing these ministries, as you say, they're not the personnel, we're concerned about how the Taliban will take these on. Should America reopen, give them access to reserves, get the humanitarian assistance and support, or is this kind of essentially now too much of a risk until the situation stabilizes and we have a clear perspective on the future?
I think it should be given a limited access to these reserves in return for some commitments. Forming an inclusive coalition government being the top priority. I think giving full access to reserves would be really catastrophic. You're dealing with a terrorist organization, which still has deals with Al Qaeda and others, and themselves, as well. 9 billion reserves at their disposal is not good for not just the region, but U.S. and the global security. But given that there are a lot of people who would need support, I think humanitarian assistance off budget, not going through the government or any Taliban formation should move ahead. UN agencies have a lot of expertise in Afghanistan. The cash for work and food for work programs should immediately start because a lot of people are in desperate situation. For US, it has unfortunately done a lot of damage to its reputation. I don't think, with how the withdrawal happened and how, redescribing what success in Afghanistan was and nation building not part of it. I think still, I believe it has some leverage. It has some leverage on the neighbors and particularly Pakistan, to make sure that this sort of a coalition government is formed. Otherwise, so these sanctions should continue.
And what would give you some optimism or some hope about a coalition? What would you want to see in a coalition that you think is feasible, that's not just completely pie in the sky? That, like, if I saw this happening, this could be steps in the right direction towards perhaps a more inclusive, what would you want to see in the coming weeks?
Non-Taliban elements being part of it, such as the Tajiks and the Northern Alliance, the Panjshir resistance, which is still the legitimate government with the first VP as the caretaker right now. They have a role in this government. More inclusivity of inclusivity of minorities, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks, and non-Pashtun Tajiks and other ethnicities. Because right now, while as a Pashtun, I would say that Taliban don't necessarily belong to one ethnicity, but they effectively are. And I think that some of those, and if we wish for a more sustainable outcome, some of human and women rights, what happens to these women who've done education, who are working, who are progressing, and suddenly they are confined to their houses, some sort of assurance that they would be able to continue their role in the society beyond the household.
Well, look, I want to now open it up to questions from the audience. I'm going to invite Professor Mark Giordano here, who's monitoring the Facebook Live, and I'm going to keep switching from the audience to the Facebook Live. I think we have roaming mics for students here who want to ask. So I'm going to start with the first question there from the students. If I could ask you to identify yourself, and then we'll take something from Facebook Live.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jasmine Al-Saeed. I'm in the MSF program, or MSFS program here at Georgetown University. Minister, thank you for coming to speak to the community today. You gave a nod to Pakistan's involvement in Afghanistan earlier. Do you give credibility to the scholarly work that the Pakistani ISI has utilized tactics like guerrilla warfare and the like to infiltrate and weaken Afghanistan? And then to what extent? And then do you also give credibility to the work that suggests that the US is aware of the vast corruption that you mentioned earlier in your time at the Ministry of Finance?
Yeah, I think I don't come from a security background, but the reports that I've seen, that reports that the U.S. intelligence has seen, I think it's not a secret anymore of the ISI's role. What I hear from people and friends is, right now, door-to-door manhunt is happening in Afghanistan, and you see ISI's active involvement with this. A friend yesterday was telling me how his NGO, they barged in and asked, and there were two guys standing behind, visibly not Afghans, not asking questions, but they had a sheet and asking, what are you doing, and this and that, basically validating information. We know where they came from. With the U.S. on corruption, if they were not aware of this, it's incompetence. With the level of corruption not this high, but I think they were also confused between bringing unity versus outright fight with corruption. Because when you call of unity, some of these big warlords were involved in corruption and smuggling gold and dollars and siphoning national revenues. So I think they were confused with that. But the fight on corruption could have been much better benchmarked by the international community. I think they also did not do the government a favor. There were situations where the government went tough on somebody on corruption, and then the US said, can you be a bit lenient on these guys, unfortunately.
So you're saying that even when the Afghan government wanted to take action against corrupt officials, maybe corrupt warlords or others, the US pressured the Afghan government not to take that action because they were concerned about
stability. Yes. X and Y as a big ally of us in the north. Can you not do this? Not the right time for this, and the like.
Let me go to Facebook Live.
Right. Here's a question from Alex Sayada. It's speaking about the raising finances for the Taliban. The question is, what source of revenue will they use for their finances now that foreign aid is cut off? What are the main sources of revenue that the Taliban can count on now or into the future, whether that be resources or customs?
Yeah. So even in the last couple of years, they had their own custom checkpoints. They had a rate, 30,000-20,000 AFs per truck, and everybody knew, unfortunately. and they would get that. Right now, that would be increased manifold, since they not only control those checkpoints but also the official borders. The second big one was the narco dollars, the money that was raised through poppy cultivation in a Taliban-controlled area, and also illegal mining. If you look at the appearance of Taliban in places where you would not traditionally associate them with, for example, in a Tajik Badakhshan, suddenly you have a mine, a lapis lazuli mine found, and instability happens and people with guns appear. So they had a lot of income from that, and unfortunately right now they have the whole state at their disposal.
Let me take a question. The gentleman there, in the middle.
Okay. Hey, I'm Jakob. I'm from Germany. I'm studying here in the Majors program. My question is more like, help me understand this man, your president. Because you spoke very highly of him and mentioned his innovative ideas, but you also mentioned his difficult temper. And I'm just thinking, if I'd be the president and I asked somebody personally to come in as being my finance minister, and 8 months later he gives me his resignation, I would come back to him in some way or the other. You said he didn't. And I'm just thinking, like, is it his temper? Was he so angry at you, or is he just lost or cynical?
Yeah, good question. The thing with the president was he had this temper, but a very kind heart as well. So we had a tough meeting, where he said some things, I said some things, and I left, and then we had another meeting immediately after that, a bigger meeting, so he was very pleasant and this and that. It was also the people around him. I know that the National Security Advisor had resigned maybe 20 times or so. So they had, he sort of thought, it's, these people, it's going to be all right. I was not going to go through that humiliation. If he had asked me, he should have trusted me, and I said, if I resign, I go. I don't stay, and we will make up in a few days. But that's why I put my resignation. It was not to pressure him, or something. I expected from him to ask me why, but I waited 3-4 days, and I thought it's a good notice, for him to respond. He hasn't. Should leave.
Let me take another question here, just at the end. Yeah.
So my name is Tala. I'm a junior in the SFS. And you spoke quite a bit about the international community. So I come from Lebanon. It's a country that's also fighting corruption. And one of the biggest debates we always have is how much should we expect the international community to come in aid to us, and how much it's on us to be fixing the internal issues. So my question is, ideally, what do you expect the international community should be doing to keep the conversation about Afghanistan and to keep solving this crisis? Because you said that there were times where you felt that they let you down in some way, Afghanistan in general. So what's ideally the position you expect the international community to have in regards to Afghanistan now?
So on the corruption, a lot of lessons learned. Unfortunately, not new lessons. It's the things that G7 plus and other mechanisms would advocate. You use country systems. You have a unified voice, not to confuse the government, and then have clear benchmarks. And sometimes those happen. Most of the times, unfortunately, not. Every donor had their own interests to follow. But from now on, I think I responded to this on pressure and leverage to form a coalition government. Right now, there is a power vacuum. There is no government in Afghanistan. Nobody recognizes Taliban as a legitimate government, and the legitimate government is confined to one of the smallest provinces in Afghanistan. I think in return for humanitarian assistance, in return for assistance overall, there should be some preconditions set by the international community. And I think despite the problems, a lot was achieved in Afghanistan. You know, I was talking with the dean earlier, you know, a few years ago, we were comparing our PFM mechanisms with middle income countries, and not exaggerating, you know, they were really good, you know. So the patience that the international community had with Afghanistan, and suddenly running out of patience, and President Biden's last days, you know, of withdrawal, blaming all on Afghans, I think was not right, and you needed more patience. You needed more patience to build a nation. But still, I believe it's still the situation could be somehow salvaged, you know, with the leverage that the international community still has, because Taliban know that they cannot run a government without the finances and technical assistance that comes from other countries.
Let me take it from Facebook.
From Rachel Giancarlo, so you mentioned already the need for a coalition government, but what concrete steps beyond that would be needed to bring stability?
Honestly, I haven't thought through this, and nobody has, you know. But that's a good first step. I think. Why did we go to Afghanistan? You know, the rhetoric that the West had for so many years for human rights and values, those discussions need to be revived. I think it has been lost in the evacuation of the last 2-3 weeks, and Biden's stress that we were there to dismantle Al-Qaeda and can kill Osama bin Laden, and we did, and we shouldn't have stayed beyond that. You know, I think what the international community did was values, you know, democracy, human rights, women's rights. Those would be some concrete steps that you would want. You know, what sort of a government? How would this government come into power? Will people have a say on it, or just a few mullahs in a madrasa would decide the fate of 35 million people? I think these would be some concrete steps, you know, that doesn't have to be the exact republic system that we had right now, but it could be somewhere where people have a voice in choosing their leadership.
From the audience, yeah, right up here in front.
Hello, Minister. Thank you for being with us today. My name's Ariman. I'm in the SFS. My question concerns a comment you had earlier about how President Ghani sometimes exaggerated how well things were in Afghanistan. So I was wondering, was funding for the Afghani military and army something that played a key role in why Taliban were able to take over, or was it a multitude of other factors?
Just to clarify, it was people who would exaggerate situation to him. You know, so he would see. So there was this, might have heard of this term, Kabul bubble. You know, not a lot of ministers traveled outside Kabul. You know, I tried to do that. I went to some of the insecure most places, and in some places I was the first minister of finance who had set foot. You know, so you would see people. With presidents' visits to provinces, you know, everything was prearranged. He would go into to the governor's compound or to an army base. People would be screened from 4 a.m., you know, who could come in, you know. So it was all, he did not really get to see the people, you know. His media office would only, for example, print good comments from social media and print it out to him. And he would have screened access to articles in the media. So that was part of the issue. Part of the other issue was the mechanisms that we had. Like with the army, the Americans and coalition were paying for them. They had a system. They had actually two systems. No system first, and then a UNDP run attendance system, and then another one that was funded by the US. And to us at Ministry of Finance, the needs that came were bottom up. So meaning a commander would say how many people are there and this and that, and it would be collected with the Ministry of Defense and come to us. I did not have a visibility on the number of people, a verification mechanism that I had for civil servants. Unfortunately, my conclusion is we never had the 300,000 police and army that were claimed and we spent for, there were many times below that. And that's why in the last few weeks when they said we're fighting, because you did not have people. And regiments where you would have 2,000 people, there were 40, 50. And these commanders, they would verify the food that was brought by a contractor, and divide the profits with them, and testify. These people were all lying to the president, So he came to understand all this very late, and that's why part of his paranoia was, and maybe rightly so, most people around him, he had lost trust. He did not trust anything, and what I believe, with people like me who had integrity, would not be worried about his temper and give him the cold truth. He also thought we were lying, and that's why the trust was lost. So the mechanisms through which he was getting information were limited, and I blame the inner circle around him, but I chiefly blame him because his temper meant that most good people left. Most good people left because they did not want to stand the humiliation, for public service. If you're not a thief and you don't, have any other interest, why would you stay and work? You would go and find something more respectable. People who stuck around were people who made a lot of money through this. They took the humiliation in return for these illicit earnings that they made. And unfortunately, the inner circle became an inner circle of two people around the president in the last few days, and the two people who fled with him, and that brought down the whole republic. But there is also an area that I've been thinking, of how we set up this presidential system was extremely centralized. It shouldn't have been this centralized. Provinces had no say in stuff. If you are a governor to a province, you could not decide on schools and clinics, how much money goes where. It was the Ministry of Public Health in the center who would plan, who would fight for the budget, who would defend it and even change it. They would bring it to Ministry of Finance and say, because of X, Y, Z reasons, we cannot build a school here because they made a deal with an MP somewhere else, the minister, and they would just make an amendment to the budget, send it somewhere else. And when you have so much centralization dependent on just one person or a few in Kabul, and that person leaves, you have a pyramid that does not have a top, and suddenly everything collapses. If we had a bit of a decentralized system, I'm sure it would not have happened. But decentralization, raising decentralization, was a tough issue in Afghanistan, because, especially for the majority Pashtuns, because if I, as a Minister of Finance, would raise decentralization, I was seen as somebody who betrayed his Pashtun ethnicity. And it would be, why would you divide the authority that Pashtuns, usually the presidents and others, would have with others? But in retrospect, that was a huge blunder. We tried to do there was built-in some financial decentralization for the next year's budget that we were going to do in January, and unfortunately, we did not have the time for that.
In response to that, you talked a lot about the personality of the president and his increasing distance from everyone, lack of trust. Tell us a little bit about the relationship at the highest level of government, the cabinet level, president, ministers, with the Americans. how was the dialogue? Was there really dialogue, information, discussion, engagement between the Americans at the highest level and at the president's office and at the minister's level? And what changed? Did much change between the Trump and the Biden administration? Was there a change in the way America engaged at the highest level? Because one thing that was known by then is President Ghani's prickly personality was well known to many people since he became president. And I think it, from what we understand, it annoyed President Obama as much as it annoyed President Trump and others. But was the dialogue between the U.S. and Afghanistan robust in these final weeks as the Biden administration made these decisions, or was most of these just communicated after the fact to the Afghan leadership?
So I think one of the issues was going a little bit back, a couple of years, the deal between Taliban and the U.S., and then they're selling it. Oh, we'll have another round of discussions between Taliban and the government. I think it really put the government in a really disadvantaged position, because the Taliban would say, we don't recognize you. We have a deal with the invaders and they're leaving, and we are the vectors, and we don't have to deal with you. I think that was a huge blunder by the U.S., and I would call it a betrayal, of all the work of 20 years that was done. But not much change between Biden and Trump administration, but a little bit more specificity of what sort of support the U.S. would give, on counterterrorism, some assistance on army and financing and aircrafts and other ammunition. So a lot of those discussions, including the last time a high-level delegation was in Kabul, and then President coming here. But we did not see most of it, maybe because President Ghani fled. We did not have the chance, but also some of the things that the U.S. did, and pulling out contractors, pulling out proprietary software and all the training to the army, it paralyzed everything. It meant they were not able to fight. So even if those fighter planes were provided without the technical assistance, it would have meant nothing.
Let me go back to the audience. I see just on the end there. Yeah.
Being here. My name is Tina. I'm in Russian and Eurasian Studies program. And I myself come from the war-torn country, Georgia. We fought war with Russia in 2008, so I know how ugly that I myself experienced. So I know how ugly war can get, especially towards civilians and ordinary people. And my question is about this. When it comes to human dimension, what is happening with Afghan people right now? Because, political elites, they have freedom to flee the country, but what about those who are left behind? That's my question. And I've been watching interviews that the Taliban is giving to different Western media, and basically what they are saying is that, of course, and I quote, one of them said that they don't understand the international hysteria, especially when it comes to women, and they say that, of course, they want women to be in workforce and they want them to be properly schooled, and that they announce this amnesty. So is this really happening? Because I have been reading a lot of articles that say the contrary, that actually they are going after the people. For instance, ordinary interpreters who worked with Americans and other Western forces. So what is happening with them right now? Are they somehow protected? And also generally how the situation, especially with regards to women's and human rights, is affecting the overall region itself, so Afghanistan's immediate neighboring countries. That's my question. Yes.
Let's take that question, and then I'll take this from Facebook.
Okay. Thank you, Tina. I think what the Taliban have been saying, what they're doing, are completely two different things. They were a bit lenient in Kabul, they were waiting not to create troubles, for US and international forces to pack up and go. But I know of different sources, not just media, of their door-to-door manhunt and, telling people not to go outside, but there are a few resilient women. But, what they say and what they do is completely two different things. They would say, obviously, they would have access to education, but they cannot be in the same classroom with male students. They cannot, in some places, go because of security reasons beyond grade 6. They cannot have a male teacher and all of this, which practically means, all indications are there. If anything, they are more brutal than what they were 20 years ago. They see as rightful people in authority, and it was taken from them for 20 years. So there's a lot of resentment and anger, and with the younger population, with women, which has unfortunately been bad. And we have to wait and see. It's what happens in the next few weeks. What happens when the government institutions open up? How do they treat women employees? Will they be allowed to come out or not? Will a woman need a chaperone to go out for groceries or something else?
Let me take it from Facebook Live.
The name of the person who asked the question I've lost now in the feed, but it was a follow-up essentially to your comments about centralization. And the question had to do with the role of the international community, or the United States in particular, in pressuring or not a centralized approach to governance?
Of what?
The centralized approach to governments that you mentioned before, what was the role of the international community of the United States in encouraging or discouraging that approach?
I think, unfortunately, most of international community did not discuss this or understand this. The discussions have been very limited. I don't recall any dedicated discussion on decentralization, except when some of us raised it and limited, on fiscal issues. How can we decentralize? How can, for example, 40% of the budget be decided in provinces? But when the constitution was done, it was not, I think, thought through well. The king was just maybe replaced with the president, and most of those things. How the governors would be appointed, or whether they would be elected. Not much of a discussion. Or the mayors, while they were in the recent law to be elected, not even one example, because carrying out the election was an issue. But also, their engagement with the provinces were through these provincial reconstruction teams. I don't know if you've heard it, with military going and with their strategy of winning hearts and minds. A lot of money. USAID would get a chunk of what the Department of Defense would spend. So they were filling that gap. If I were a governor, I would tell them, we need a clinic here, and they would immediately build it, or a road somewhere else. So basically, you did not need central revenues and resources to flow through a channel, because first of all, they were so minute, and you had easy money through the military. But then after 2014, the PRTs ceased to exist, and then the pressures started.
Let me take a question from the floor, right here. Yeah, in the third row.
Hi, I'm Michael Scanlon in the business school here. I have a question. I think the U.S. spent some $2 trillion over the past 20 years. If you were to get a fraction of that, let's just throw out $500 billion, what would you do with no strings attached and not having any other outside financing after that?
Yeah, Good question. First of all, the 2 trillion, most of it did not go to Afghanistan. I remember we did for a transition in 2014 a study with the World Bank. The Department of Defense, 110 billion spent in that year, part of Obama's surge. Only 7 billion came to Afghanistan. The rest were contracts between Washington and Arlington and other places. And so that a fraction of it, and then of what came, most went back in salaries and all of this. So 500 billion would be a lot of money. You could run a really good budget process with this, but it's easier said than done. You would need a lot of support, from the whole government. You would need a support from the governors and the parliament, but it's doable. What I would do with that is, run it all through the government, because despite its issues, the money spent through the government had better accountability and visibility than money spent directly through contractors. So I would put it mostly through the government, but in some cases off budget or direct spending made a bit more sense, like in humanitarian. Government bureaucracies sometimes did not make it possible. But part of making sure that the money goes into right places would have been the accountability part of it, which was unfortunately missing. The budget process was one way, would start every year with a cycle. This is what we'll do. No reporting at the end of the year of what we did with this money. And in some cases, nothing was built, unfortunately. You would have billions of AFs going into building clinics that did not exist, that my staff did not have in that province, did not have the authority to go, and there was no institution to go and verify whether a building was built or not. I can tell you last year in Balkh province, 1.3 billion, around $30 million were spent on clinics that did not exist. It was a collusion of the Ministry of Public Health, the director there, and one of the deputy speakers of the parliament, and with no visibility. Most of these did not exist, unfortunately. Fake invoices were made. And Ministry of Finance's job was just to see the invoice and then pay.
I'm going to take a final question from each, from Facebook Live, and then from the audience, maybe from Facebook Live, and then I'll go to the audience.
Go to the audience first.
All right. Let me see, because I'm...
you have a hand.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Elena Martinez. I'm a first year in the School of Foreign Service studying international politics. So you just touched on this, but you reminded me also during your portion with Dean Hellman, when you mentioned that there is not a lot of oversight when it comes to the World Bank looking at where humanitarian funds are going. I read an article last week that mentioned that a lot of projects that were overseen by the American government had funds mismanaged or they weren't even used. So I'd like to know, where do you think this money went, and why do you think there's such a disconnect between the American government and the government of Afghanistan?
Thank you. So first of all the money that came to Afghanistan was not spent through the government. For the government to take all the blame, I think, was a bit unfair. If the USAID, for example, talking of latest figures, around 600 million of all development work to do in Afghanistan, 200 million went through the government, through the World Bank's trust fund and to health and education. The rest 400, they planned, directly hired USAID contractors and paid. In most cases, I, as the Minister of Finance, was not consulted where the needs are. So we did not have any control on them, on any visibility, any mechanisms to check and verify whether that money was paid. Unfortunately, this off budget, which was not going through our PFM system, we never had the total figures. We only estimated because of technical issues, different financial years, but mostly because of underreporting. So when you don't have a say in selecting the projects, you don't have regular reportings to you. I think it's really difficult for the Afghan government to then be accountable for it.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question from the audience then, and I'm going to take that gentleman there.
Thank you so much for being here again. My question is, what are your plans for the coming years? Will you continue your service to the Afghan people from abroad, or would you return if a coalition government or even the Taliban called on you to run the minister back in Afghanistan?
I'll do what my wife says after this, because last time when I had this job offer, I said, there was a voicemail from the National Security Advisor. I told my wife, this is the offer for Ministry of Finance. I hadn't read it. I said, if you don't want this, I can block this number, and they will never hear. But I've left her to do all the household stuff. I think I've been selfish with my education and then raising children. So I'll do what she says, and she says no more Afghanistan. But that does not mean I went back for my people. In any other capacity. I think my philosophy is you don't have to be a civil servant to service the people and serve them. I think there would be more opportunities. I'm still young. I think I peaked a bit early. But that means new opportunities. I don't know. There are also values issues. I would not work with a Taliban government where human and basic women rights are a question, where they think women are inferior. While I learned so many things from my brilliant female colleagues. So it's also that issue. They've approached for advice, but I've said, we don't recognize you as a government as of now.
Well, I wonder, maybe it's just a final word from you. We heard the president's speech. I'm curious to hear your reactions to President Biden's speech, because what he was saying was sort of setting out a different understanding of America's role in the world. One in which America really has no business, as he was saying, engaging in this long-term process of institution building. It should be much more direct, much more focused, much more engaged on the direct security interests. Having, you lived through this process. You and I were talking about the fact that the Taliban came, the American invasion came. You were in school in Pakistan. Most of your adult kind of professional life was involved in this effort of trying to build new institutions in a very, very difficult country. Do you think that America could return to thinking about how to do this in a different way, or there's really this is such a difficult process that can only be done sort of internally, that America really can't be thinking about a different way of engaging to make this process of strengthening democracy, building stability in other countries more robust, more successful in the future?
Yeah, I understand the fatigue that the donors and especially the U.S. had with Afghanistan. I think the media had a big role to play. Every TV series I look, there is somebody who is a veteran in Afghanistan, and so we are always bombarded with Afghanistan being associated with negative stuff, But what about U.S.'s engagement in Korea, and you still have bases in Germany, and to just say that you cannot maintain forces in Afghanistan, I think it was contradictory to the good advice subsequent U.S. presidents got from their military. It did not have to be expensive. I think if Afghanistan becomes a safe haven for terrorists, it's going to be very, very expensive, intervening in Afghanistan or the region. So, but also the U.S.'s credibility, as a superpower, you have a say in the world stage. So I think, the few strategic mistakes the U.S. made, well, now it's easy to look in retrospect, the Iraq war that took a lot of focus and resources from Afghanistan. Obama's surge, which said, we'll increase the fighting and then we'll stop it in 2014, which basically meant to Taliban you have to hang around for a couple of more years, and then the deal, Zalmay Khalilzad's horrible deal with Taliban. We are looking at the aftermaths now. I think right now for the U.S. president to say that we did not have to do this, I think it's more costly. You don't want another 9/11. So it's for the U.S. If you want to focus only on the U.S., then you don't have much of a say in world affairs. I don't think that's in the best interest of the whole world.
Well, look, at this extraordinary moment in our relationship with Afghanistan, we're deeply grateful to you for coming here, spending so much time with us, talking about your own experiences, answering the questions students and from Facebook Live. We wish you all the best in the next stage of the career. We advise you to listen to that advice of your wife. And we really look forward to seeing what you do next. So thank you for coming here, and thank you all for joining us on this rainy afternoon. Thank you. Thank you very much.